Okay, I think we're up and running. So, my speech is about something called the Darien scheme. So it's Darien. That's how I'm pronouncing it. It's in Central America, so it might be Darien. I don't know. But you'll find out more about it as we go along. And there's a person in the speech, it features in the speech, called William Patterson. And it's about Scotland. There's a Scottish link. So there's the Bank of Scotland, there's the Company of Scotland. And I think that's probably about it. Okay. And I think it's probably going to be quite a long speech, so I'll cut it in two. If it gets above 10 minutes or so, I'll chop it in two. And if it's not that long, then I have another kind of more improvised speech that I can do. Okay. Are we ready? Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay, good. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today I've chosen a slightly, perhaps controversial topic for my speech, but it's not the predictable side of the controversial topic, shall we say. It's a speech about colonialism. Now, colonialism is something that can be a bit of a black and white topic. The people who think it was a good thing are very pro-colonialism. They think, oh, we brought civilization to those barbaric nations. We brought them religion. We brought them culture. Look at all the infrastructure that they have now thanks to us. And this is an attitude that you can see certainly in the UK at the moment. There's a bit of colonial nostalgia going on. I've certainly heard it from French people as well. Maybe here on the streets of Brussels you might hear it. So there's that point of view when it comes to colonialism. And then there's the more critical side where people talk about the barbaric treatment of the local people, the land grabbing that went on, the theft of cultural property. This speech isn't really a judgment of colonialism. I think probably from my tone of voice you can imagine which side of the coin I'm on. But it's not a judgment. I'm just going to describe a failed colonial venture. Now, when you think of the colonial powers, you probably think of the English, you think of the French, the Spaniards, the Dutch, maybe even the Belgians. But I bet you don't think of the Scottish. Now, the Scottish, Scotland is obviously part of the United Kingdom, and there were many Scots involved in the British Empire and British colonial exploits. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is very much a Scottish venture, and it's called the Darien scheme. I'll go into more detail on Darien a little bit later, what it is, where it is, etc. But first of all, we need to go back in time. We need to go back to the 17th century. Now, as you probably know, Scotland became united with England in 1603. It shared the same king back at the beginning of the 17th century. Before that, Scotland was independent. And this event was considered a failure by many Scottish people. They thought, we were an independent country and now we're being bullied around, in a sense, by our larger neighbour to the south. But Scotland retained some independence. It still had its own parliament, its own laws, it had some say over its finances. But there was this idea that, we're the poor relation now and we need something, we need a big venture to get everyone excited again. So in the 1690s, it was decided that the Bank of Scotland would be set up and that there would be a company called the Company of Scotland. So this gave a sense of optimism and hope to some Scottish people that Scotland would be able to maintain some independence and some entrepreneurial spirit despite being united with the English. But the 1690s, despite this optimism, the 1690s was not a very optimistic time. There were a lot of financial problems, there were wars, there was famine. So there were a lot of problems going on. But despite this slightly gloomy, pessimistic backdrop, there was a Scotsman called William Patterson, and he decided that Scotland needed a colony. Scotland needed to branch out and find new opportunities in the world. And he started something called the Darien scheme. Now, as I say, that's my English-speaking pronunciation of this place, because it's not at all an English-speaking country originally, or area, Darien. Darien is actually located in Central America, in what is today Panama. Now, when you think of Panama, probably the first thing that comes into your mind is the Panama Canal, where boats can pass through, and it links the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. But back then, in the 1690s, that wasn't the case. There was no Panama Canal, so everything had to go overland. And William Paterson's idea was that he would colonize this area of Panama to make overland transport easier, and the Scottish would be able to earn some money by imposing customs duties on goods travelling along the way. So, Scotland, a lot of Scottish people were very hopeful about this, and they thought, oh, that's a great idea, we should invest in this idea. And from a financial point of view, it was quite successful, the fundraising, that is, for the venture. And they managed to raise an awful lot of money. They raised, at the time, £300,000. Now, £300,000 in today's money is about 60 million euros. So it was really quite a successful kickstart operation. The English frowned on this venture. They weren't happy about their Scottish neighbours getting involved in this sort of activity for a number of reasons. First of all, they saw this type of venture as being in competition with their own colonial adventures. The British had the East India Company. There was also this prevailing idea of mercantilism at the time. Now, mercantilism is a school of thought which is quite different to the one we have today. Now, when we think of capitalism, when we think of business, we often think of there being room for everyone, that everyone can get a slice of the cake. We could just have to make the cake bigger. We just expand into different markets. But back in the 17th century, there was this idea that there was only enough for certain people, that the cake could only be sliced into a certain number of pieces. So that was one reason. But William Paterson didn't let this deter him, and he decided to come onto the European continent and to look for investors in Hamburg and Amsterdam. But all of this failed, alas. The Germans and the Dutch were not interested. But this backlash, the backlash of the English and the failure to get investment, just spurred him on even more. And it actually motivated the Scots to get behind this idea even more. And there was even a very modern thing that happened. Paterson decided to talk to some prominent public figures, some influencers in today's language, and got them on board. So there were prominent politicians, businessmen, etc. And he managed to really raise an incredible amount of money. And on the 14th of July, 1698, the Caledonia, the ship, the Caledonia, set sail. Now, for those of you who know your Latin, you'll know that Caledonia is the Latin word for Scotland. So it was a very patriotic mission. And the ship set sail with 1,200 people on board, and they set off to Darien in what's now Panama. The journey was very difficult. It was very long. It took about 4 months or so for them to arrive. They finally arrived in November. And at the beginning, everything was great. It was a beautiful location with great weather, very different to Scotland. The locals were very friendly at the beginning. Where they landed, there was a great big harbour which they thought could welcome thousands of ships, so great potential for the future. The soil was very good quality, but soon things started to go wrong. One of the main problems was illness. Where they landed, there was malaria and yellow fever coming from the swamps. So a number of people started to die, including Paterson's own wife. So that made things very difficult, obviously. Then they had to set about building infrastructure. There was nothing in place. It was a sort of tropical destination, but there was absolutely no infrastructure. So they set up a settlement, an area called New Edinburgh. Once again, very patriotic. And a lot of hard work had to go into that. They didn't necessarily have all the materials that they needed. It was incredibly hot. These were Scottish people, Scottish men who weren't used to the heat. There was thick forest that they had to cut through. And once again, there was a lot of illness. There were a lot of diseases that these white Scottish men and women were not used to. And there was another problem, which was that they didn't really have a lot of food. The food that they brought with them from Scotland wasn't stored properly. They didn't have the technology that we have today, like refrigerators. So the food that they brought with them had obviously gone off. But their alcohol hadn't gone off, so there was plenty of booze. But this was obviously not a great thing. Hard work and alcohol don't really go together. So quite a few of the men, either they got ill or they were drunk a lot of the time. So it was very difficult for them to actually achieve anything. As I said, the local people were very friendly at the beginning, but they weren't friendly for long because they were kind of thinking, well, why are these people coming and trying to take our things? And the whole thing was very badly organised, really. The Scots thought that they could exchange some goods from Scotland with the local people, but they didn't really think through the types of goods that the local people would be interested in. They brought with them, for example, wigs and combs and shoes and things that people living in Central America in the 17th century just wouldn't be interested in. So the settlement was abandoned and a fort was built to defend the area from the Spanish. So they still had the idea that they would potentially keep the area just as a fort. But we're talking about Central America, and as you know, the Spaniards were very present in Central and South America. So the Spaniards were not best pleased about the Scots occupying Darien. And I'll come to the Spaniards in a moment. I'll take a break and you can give each other some feedback.